I've been a truck driver for nearly 20 years now, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. Weird weather, bizarre wildlife, the occasional runaway animal, but nothing like what I encountered last month. I still don't know what to make of it, but I thought I'd share it here, just in case someone else has seen something similar. It was a typical late shift, just me and my rig rolling down Route 22, a long, lonely stretch of highway that cuts through the backwoods of West Virginia. It was around 2 a.m. and the road was empty. I'd been driving for hours and was looking forward to hitting the next rest stop, grabbing a cup of coffee and stretching my legs. The only light was from my headlights slicing through the darkness and the occasional reflective road sign flashing by. The thing about night driving is that you get used to the isolation. The hum of the engine becomes your only companion, the white lines on the road your guide. You learn to trust your instincts, to keep your eyes open for any sign of trouble, a deer in the road, a patch of black ice, or, as it happened that night, a lone figure standing by the side of the highway. At first I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a woman standing on the shoulder waving her arms. She was wearing a long, dark coat that billowed in the wind, and her hair was wild, whipping around her face. I slowed down, my instincts kicking in. I'd picked up hitchhikers before, usually drifters or folks down on their luck, but there was something about her that gave me pause. Still, I couldn't just leave her there. It was the middle of nowhere and she looked desperate. I pulled over a few yards ahead and waited for her to approach. She didn't move at first, just stood there, staring at my truck. I leaned out the window and waved. "Need a ride?" I called out. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly started walking toward me. As she got closer, I could see her more clearly in the glow of my headlights. She was pale, too pale, and her eyes were wide and unblinking. There was something off about her gait too, like she was limping or dragging one of her feet. When she finally reached the passenger side, I noticed she wasn't wearing any shoes. Her feet were bare and dirty, and she had this haunted look in her eyes like she hadn't slept in days. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I forced a smile. "Where you headed?" I asked. "Just up the road," she replied in a soft, trembling voice. "Can you take me there?" I nodded, though I didn't feel right about it. Something about her just seemed wrong. But what was I supposed to do? Leave her there in the middle of the night? So I unlocked the door and she climbed in, settling into the seat beside me. As we started driving, I tried to make small talk, but she wasn't much of a conversationalist. She just sat there, staring straight ahead, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Every now and then, I'd catch her glancing at me out of the corner of her eye, and it made my skin crawl. After a few minutes, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "So, what brings you out here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She didn't answer right away. She just kept staring ahead, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, finally, she spoke. "I was looking for someone," she said quietly. "Oh," I replied, glancing at her. "Who?" She didn't answer. She just kept staring straight ahead. I felt a knot form in my stomach, and I decided to leave it at that. We drove on in silence for a while, the only sound the rumble of the engine and the hum of the tires on the asphalt. Then, out of nowhere, she turned to me and said, "Do you believe in ghosts?" The question caught me off guard, and I chuckled nervously. "I don't know," I said. "I guess I've never really thought about it." She nodded, her eyes fixed on me. "They're real, you know," she whispered. "They're everywhere." A chill ran down my spine, and I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "Is that so?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond. She just turned back to the road, her expression blank. I was starting to regret picking her up. There was something about her, something dark, something that didn't feel quite right. I was just about to ask her where exactly she wanted to be dropped off when she suddenly pointed ahead. "There," she said. "Pull over there." I squinted through the windshield, trying to see what she was pointing at. Up ahead, I saw a small dirt road branching off the highway. It wasn't marked, just a narrow, overgrown path that disappeared into the woods. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. "Are you sure?" I asked. "There's nothing out there." She turned to me, her eyes wide and pleading. "Please," she whispered. "I need to go there." Against my better judgment, I slowed down and turned onto the dirt road. The trees closed in around us, their branches scraping against the sides of the truck like fingers. I drove for a few more minutes, the path getting narrower and narrower, until finally the road ended in a small clearing. I put the truck in park and turned to her. "Is this it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She nodded, her eyes locked on something outside the window. I followed her gaze and felt my heart stop. There, in the middle of the clearing, was an old abandoned house. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Its windows were shattered, the roof sagging, and the front door hanging off its hinges. "I have to go," she said suddenly, opening the door and stepping out. "Wait," I called after her. "You can't go in there. It's not safe." But she didn't listen. She just kept walking toward the house, her bare feet crunching on the gravel. I watched her disappear into the darkness, a sense of dread settling over me. I sat there for a few minutes, debating whether I should go after her or just leave. But something told me not to follow. There was something wrong with that place, something that made every instinct in my body scream to get out of there. Finally, I decided to go. I put the truck in reverse and backed out of the clearing, my heart pounding. As I turned back onto the highway, I glanced in my rearview mirror and felt my blood run cold. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the woman. She was watching me, her eyes glowing in the darkness. I blinked, and she was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a while, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I've thought about it a lot since then, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I was tired, or that the darkness played tricks on me, but deep down I know what I saw. I've driven that stretch of Route 22 many times since that night, but I've never seen her again, and I hope I never do. I was never a fan of night driving. There's something about the dark that makes everything feel more intense, more alive. But I didn't have much of a choice that night. My best friend Laura was getting married the next day, and I was running late after getting stuck at work. I had to drive through Devil's Pass, a stretch of winding mountain road. The locals had all sorts of stories about it. Ghost sightings, mysterious accidents, even the occasional disappearance. But I never put much stock in any of that. I'm a city girl, born and raised, and I figured it was just rural superstition. I left the city around 10 p.m., hoping to make it to the small mountain town by midnight. The first hour was fine, just me, the radio, and the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. But as I got deeper into the mountains, the road got narrower, and the trees seemed to close in around me. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the only light came from my headlights, which barely cut through the darkness. About halfway through Devil's Pass, I noticed something strange. The road signs looked older, more worn, as if they hadn't been replaced in decades. The markings on the road were faded, almost invisible. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, trying to see where I was going. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. The car skidded to a stop just a few feet from the figure. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat that seemed to blend into the night. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could see his eyes glinting in the headlights. I rolled down my window, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out. He didn't answer. He just stood there staring at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about him didn't seem right. He was too still, too silent. I considered turning around and heading back, but the road was too narrow and there wasn't enough room to maneuver. I was stuck. After a few tense moments, he finally moved. He raised one arm and pointed down a narrow dirt road that branched off from the main highway. I hadn't noticed it before. It was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and lined with ancient trees that loomed over it like sentinels. "Go that way," he said, his voice low and flat, almost mechanical. "It's faster." I hesitated. Everything in me screamed not to listen to him, to just keep driving, but there was something in his tone, something that made it hard to refuse. Against my better judgment, I nodded and slowly turned onto the dirt road. The path was rough and uneven, and I had to drive slowly to avoid hitting the deep ruts and rocks. The trees were so close on either side that their branches scraped against the sides of the car, making a sound like nails on a chalkboard. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, but the man was gone. It was as if he had vanished the moment I turned onto the dirt road. The deeper I drove, the darker it got. The trees seemed to close in even more, their branches twisting together above me, blocking out what little moonlight there was. My headlights barely penetrated the thick shadows. I turned up the radio, hoping to drown out the unsettling sounds of the forest, but all I got was static. I tried switching stations, but it was all the same, just static mixed with faint, distorted voices that seemed to whisper just out of reach. Then, without warning, my car died. The engine sputtered and cut out, leaving me in total darkness. I tried to restart it, but nothing happened. The battery was dead. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding. I felt completely and utterly alone, swallowed up by the darkness. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping on the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping came again, a little louder this time. I turned slowly, my eyes wide with fear, and saw a face pressed against the glass. It was the man from the road. His eyes were wild, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. I screamed and tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. He kept tapping on the glass, his grin widening with each tap. "Let me in," he whispered, his voice barely audible through the glass. "Let me in." I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, but when I looked down, I saw it was dead too. No signal, no battery, nothing. I was trapped. The tapping continued, relentless and rhythmic. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, panic setting in. I tried the car door, but it was locked. I tried to start the car again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Then, all at once, the tapping stopped. I looked up, and he was gone. I glanced around, my heart still racing, but there was no sign of him. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned the key again, praying for the engine to start, and this time it did. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the path ahead, and I slammed my foot on the gas, desperate to get out of there. But as I sped down the dirt road, I realized something horrifying. The trees were different. They were denser, thicker, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. The road was narrower too, barely wide enough for my car. I didn't recognize anything. It was as if the road had changed, transformed into something else entirely. I kept driving, panic surging through me. But no matter how far I went, the road just kept winding on and on. There were no turns, no landmarks, nothing to indicate where I was or how to get back to the main highway. It was like I was trapped in a maze, a never-ending loop. And then, just as suddenly as it had died before, my car sputtered to a stop again. This time, it didn't even try to restart. I was stuck. I sat there, staring at the dark, twisting trees, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I saw it. A faint light in the distance. It was small, barely visible through the trees, but it was there. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car, my hands shaking. I made my way toward the light, stumbling over roots and rocks, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the brighter the light became until finally I stepped into a small clearing. There, in the center, was an old cabin, its windows glowing with a soft, flickering light. I knew I shouldn't go inside. Every instinct in my body told me to turn back, to run, but I was desperate. Maybe there was a phone or a way to get help. I took a deep breath and stepped up to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and cobwebs. But there, in the center of the room, was a small table with a single candle burning on it, and sitting at the table, staring at me with that same grotesque grin, was the man from the road. "Welcome," he said, his voice a low, mocking whisper. "I've been waiting for you." I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in my car parked on the side of the main highway. The sun was rising and the road was empty. I looked around, my heart pounding, but there was no sign of the dirt road, the cabin, or the man. It was as if none of it had ever happened, but I know it did. I still have nightmares about that night, about the man and his grotesque grin. And I know one thing for sure: I'll never take a night drive through Devil's Pass again.